One, two, one, two.
And it's also
Shalom.
so good to be learning with all of you online. Um, it is, it's a sober morning. Last night in Jerusalem, we're all mindful of the attack on a synagogue in East Jerusalem that left at least 8 dead and several more wounded. And it's fraught and anxious. And we are just mindful of all of the inhabitants of Jerusalem in the region, and we pray for peace. Um, our session today, just to frame it, comes from. Sorry, Wes, is your microphone on? It is? Is it not working? If it's not working, I'll borrow this one. Apologize for the technical difficulties. Um, our class today flows from a really thing that shouldn't happen very often, but it happens all the time with Micha Goodman. He says something that I had never thought about before and had never crossed my mind before. And once he says it, it's just so obvious. It becomes a lens for all of reality. And I can't read the Torah, and I can't read the newspaper, and I can't engage with humans without thinking about this lens that I had never thought about 20 hours earlier. And the lens is, he talks about the law of unanticipated consequences. And that's in the clip, in the conversation that he had with Danny Gordis in Jerusalem. So we'll begin with that and talk about what he says, and then broaden it out to our Torah reading and to life. So let's thank God for the gift of learning Torah together.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
וערב נא אדוני אלוהינו את דברי תורתך בפינו ובפי עמך בית ישראל, ונהיה אנחנו וצאצאינו וצאצאי עמך בית ישראל, כולנו יודעי שמך ולומדי תורתך לשמה. ברוך אתה אדוני המלמד תורה לעמו ישראל.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, אשר בחר בנו מכל העמים, ונתן לנו את תורתו. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
So apparently last Friday, Micha Goodman wrote an article that became front page news in Israel's version of the Wall Street Journal. Whatever the most conservative right-of-center periodical that people read in Israel, that was page one of Micha. And Micha says, I'm writing a letter to right-of-center Israel. And here it is. Don't do aggressive leadership that you think you have the power for because you have a razor-thin majority. Don't do it, and I'm saying this to you not because it will attack the left. I'm saying to you, don't do it because it will undermine the right. And it's very possible that you will destroy the country of Israel, not the government of Israel. But he's writing this to the Wall Street Journal of Israel. He's writing this to a right-of-center publication. It's very possible that the moves you're thinking about making will destroy not just the government of Israel, but the country of Israel. He talks about the law of unanticipated consequences, and he says that this is why political philosophers like Edmund Burke were very conservative, small c, and humble and restrained, because we never know what will ensue from decisions that we make. We never know what will ensue from decisions that we make. Micha Goodman, in this podcast with Danny Gordis, gives two examples. He says that one of the unanticipated consequences of the birth control pill in Europe was radicalized, xenophobic, far-right politics. And the flow chart is that the pill becomes widely available. Therefore, European families have fewer children. Therefore, there is less available workforce. Therefore, those countries open up more immigration, which results in more Muslim immigration, which results in more cultural difference to navigate, which results in far-right xenophobic politics. And nobody really saw that coming. Why would you think that the pill would result in xenophobia? The other example that Micha gives in the podcast is about the effect of the internet on democracy, and that you would think that the internet means more information, which means a stronger marketplace of ideas. What people did not anticipate was it also results in more disinformation, and therefore more conspiracy theories, and therefore more echo chambers, and therefore people not talking to each other, the undermining of democracy. So that podcast ends with Micha saying that it's eminently foreseeable that the Knesset could strip the Supreme Court in Israel of power, and that the Supreme Court will refuse to acknowledge and accept that decision. And the Knesset will say, court, you have no power, and the court will say, Knesset, you have no power, and that real Israelis and IDF soldiers and generals will be caught in the crossfire, and it's unprecedented terrain. And therefore, Micha appeals in this right of center publication, page 1, 2 Fridays ago, please do not exercise undue big moves because of the law of unanticipated consequences. That's Micha's piece with Danny. And I was thinking now, colleagues, about this idea of the unanticipated consequences. And there's just so much application to it. I have to say, why don't we just start? And it's, again, I hadn't ever thought of this phrase like on Wednesday, until I read this, until I heard Micha. But think about Tyree Nichols, and think about Memphis. Think about the fact that the 5 black officers who brutally beat Tyree Nichols to death when he's calling for his mother and says, I just want to go home, and calling for his mother, and they're black, was a special unit that was put in particularly crime-vulnerable neighborhoods to protect the residents. And it does this. So let me just start off, because that's just so urgent. Aliza, you're the youngest and the hippest of us all. Can you, I mean, how do you understand Tyree Nichols, and how do you understand the unexpectedness of it, et cetera?
I like answering this as a young hip person. I don't know that I qualify.
Everything is relative.
It's interesting for me because that one feels like a not unintended consequence, because the way that they addressed violence and crime in those areas was by bringing in more violence. And like, you can't call that crime, but I mean, in the case of killing him, yes, you can call that crime, but the response to violence has been more violence, and that seems to me like an obvious anticipative, like something you could anticipate as a result of implementing the Scorpion unit. And I don't think that we as a society have figured out more creative ways to have, maybe if we did lots of mental health care, maybe if we did lots of support for those environments, and maybe if we did, I was in early December, I was in Baltimore visiting a friend, and she used to live in like the hardcore neighborhood of Baltimore, and she pointed out to me that they built this state-of-the-art industrial prison complex. It's the biggest building, and it divides these 2 neighborhoods, and it's giant, and they put all this money in, and then you see like the schools and the libraries and everything else which doesn't have any funding, and it shows where our resources going towards. And I think that's the case in Memphis, right? They're putting all the resources in this violent crime unit. It's not a shocker that would result in additional violence.
Is it a shocker, though, that the officers who killed a black man were themselves black? I mean, usually the scenario is it's whites who kill a black a driver. And here you have 5 black cops killing a black driver. To me, that was very unanticipated, and I don't quite get it.
But you also have, right, we've had 3 shootings by Asian Americans targeting Asian Americans recently. You have the rise of violence against your own people across the board. I think that's a very American consequence. And again, we have this, if you want to take it back to our Constitution, right, we have this right, this fundamental right that everyone can carry a gun. And the vision of our forefathers was that they should be able to protect against unjust government. And the reality on our streets today is it just means lots of people die.
Colleagues, how do you process the horrific, death of Tyree Nichols and what it says about unanticipated consequences? Because surely the Scorpion unit was not designed to do what it did.
I think Elisa had it right, that it was, that's really doesn't seem to be an unintended, in a certain sense, because that I think is easily foreseen as opposed to what Mika was saying.
Yeah. So
The other thing I was going to say is that I want to bring back a little bit of what Mika, in his article said. Mika. He says Mika, so I have to follow him. So his his analysis also just as a reminder of part of what's happening in the government now in Israel is a historical event, because Israel never really, from the beginning, never really created a constitution, at which he pointed out at the beginning of his article. So that, I think, so what's happening now is an unintended consequence of the fact that we don't have Israel does not have a true constitution,
Right.
and therefore that's part of it. The other thing is that you brought about the disinformation in the internet. I was talking to someone who's Gen Z, and they were, saying that one of the unintended consequences of this generation, is the idea that there is so much put out there by youngsters against youngsters, by kids of certain ages, that we don't see. I mean, if you're not on Instagram, and if you're not on Twitter, then you're not seeing what all the horrible things that all the kids are saying to each other, and the disinformation that they're putting out there. So I think that's another unintended consequence of the disinformation of the internet.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah.
I want to ground this whole concept of unanticipated consequences, which obviously has a resonance for today's news, back into the Torah, because we're in a section of the biblical story where it feels particularly apt. The brothers throw Joseph into a pit. It's quite unanticipated that he would become second to Pharaoh. Joseph, as second to Pharaoh, invites his family into Goshen during a time when there's no food, severe famine. It's quite unanticipated that would result in 430 years of slavery. And then the Israelites get out today in Parshat Bo, and next week's reading, which is B'Shalach, the Song of the Sea, they are on the other side of the Red Sea. Are free. The Egyptians are drowned. The Israelites look at the dead Egyptians, and they see that they're free, and they believe in God and in his servant Moses. And then 72 hours later, 3 days later, they complain, "Why did you take us out of Egypt to die in the desert?" And throughout the rest of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, they constantly complain, "Why did you take us out of Egypt to die in the desert?" And then they even come up with fictitious misinformation that we used to get cucumbers and melons and leeks for free in Egypt, all of which is extremely unanticipated. So I'd like to ask you, dear colleagues, what is the biblical story? And again, I never thought about unanticipated lens until Micha's talk, but what does it say about the human condition that we seem to get it wrong and always have?
I'll jump in. One of the things I loved about Micha's talk is the way that he emphasized that because we don't know what's going to happen, we should act moderately and without hubris. And that feels like a story of our ancestors, right? There's not a lot of moderation in Tanakh. It works in our favor in the case of Jacob, but I think about Abraham, who leaves everything he's ever known and abandons it, and that creates a whole that sets all of this in motion, right? Or the movement that Moses makes to save the Israelites from all of Egypt, which interesting then sets up all of these failed kingships that tear the country apart. And all of that happens because it's one person moving and actualizing change for a whole people that aren't yet ready for it. And that has the unintended consequence of other people feeling empowered to do that, and then it ultimately falls apart. So it feels like the lesson for us is to be humble in what we think is possible from our perspective to make small, moderate changes.
Yeah, except for here's one thing, and I, as you know, love Micha, but here's one thing that's not in his piece, and it's not in the this idea of because of unanticipated consequences, therefore be moderate, humble, and restrained, which is there is a time for bold and decisive action. There is a time for the fiery urgency of now. And I was thinking about when I listened to Micha's talk with Danny Gordis, I was thinking about the Supreme Court case Obergefell v. Hodges, which legalized same-sex marriage, and the majority legalized same-sex marriage. And John Roberts, in his dissent, who's vociferously against legalizing same-sex marriage, basically says law of unanticipated consequences, law of unanticipated consequences. You're changing an institution dramatically that has been around forever. Where's your humility? He says to the majority. So how do you think about, there is a time for humility and restraint, and there is a time for bold and decisive action. Also think, by the way, of the ways in which people of color and people who are oppressed are told by people in the power structure and the caste system, be patient, be patient, be patient. Your time will come. Be patient, be patient, be patient. Your time will come. Be humble, be restrained, be patient, be patient, be patient, which ends up being just a recipe for the status quo of oppression. So how do you balance humility and restraint with a time to act?
I'm a little confused here today. I think we are jumping from one topic to another very quickly. If you allow me, I want to go back to what you said about Moses and the slave and the Jewish slaves. We talked a little bit about yesterday. Let me give you an example. When my father always told me when I was growing up that he was the youngest of 7 kids in his family, and they were Ukrainian immigrants to Argentina who didn't know anything, and they put them in a state that they need to be farmers or become gauchos. And my grandfather had no idea how to make that, and so my father grew up in a very poor environment, all right, and he didn't have a bed for himself. He would sleep in the kitchen table. That was his childhood growing up. Do I go to sleep every night saying, oh, my bed is so great and I'm so grateful because my dad slept on a table? I don't do that. Occasionally I think about that. So what I'm trying to say is I'm trying to project the parallel between us and, like, we all have stories like that with the Jewish slaves. They were not thinking about, oh, yes, my past generations, they were slaves for 400 years. I was a slave, but I had a comfortable life. So now all of a sudden you are giving me this that is called freedom, whatever you call it. Where is my cucumber? Where is my broccoli? Like you love broccoli. Where is my broccoli? So they were not thinking, oh, I should be grateful and I should be humble because my ancestors were slaves. I want what I used to have. I want my bed. I don't care,
But Elias, in the case of the Hebrew slaves, when they yearned to go back to Egypt, the life they had was slavery. And I guess my question to you is, what does it say about the human condition, to the extent that the Torah is conveying something that's human and universal? How is it that a people that was enslaved would want to go back to being enslaved? And what does it say about us?
Well, I mean, for me, it's easy to say it. Enslave is something that is a term we use now, and perhaps it wasn't something that they were so aware of it. Imagine you have you have a job in a way, you have food, you have a house, and then all of a sudden you're in the wild and you don't have absolutely anything. The only thing you have is a promise that you will get to a land that you don't know. And with food, where is the food? And where is my house? It's easy to think that they would like to go back.
Dan?
I think a lot of it, as Elias is pointing out, a lot of it is all about human beings living in the present, living in the now.
It's Maslow's hierarchy, by the way. Right?
Yes,
it is Maslow's
exactly.
hierarchy.
Yes.
Without
Exactly.
your food and drink and a comfortable bed,
Yeah.
then notions of freedom and a land of milk and honey.
Right. And the other thing is that you hear these examples all the time of people getting comfortable with their lifestyle. And you hear this about oftentimes people that have been, say, in prison for a decade or more, God forbid, for whatever they did, that once they are released from prison, they can't. It's so very difficult for them to re-enter society. They feel much more connected to the life they had in prison because it was more. It became a standard for them.
Right.
So it's a kind of thing where change is so hard for human beings. And we are, in a certain sense, we are just still so much part of the animal kingdom, and that we are so routinized that any kind of disturbance of that actually can throw us off.
One quick example of that. I have a privilege of teaching at the cantorial school in Argentina, and I often talk to my colleagues, and I really don't understand how they continue living down there, because it's very unsafe. The country is super corrupt. Nothing works. You get a job. You need 4 jobs in order to make a living. You never see your families. And then they say to me, well, I would never live in a place that is so cold as Boston. And, it's like, imagine, that is, being comfortable with what you are, although that could be a horrible place.
Right.
Can I share?
Oh,
Michelle, no, because
Michelle, you haven't spoken yet, so.
That's okay, I can hold.
now I feel bad. And okay,
We
I
need
just
your
say all of
wisdom.
this. No, this is not wisdom. We were watching a comedy routine on Netflix called Shang Wang. He's a famous comedian, and he has this whole routine about how his parents were Taiwanese immigrants. I was thinking about this when you were talking about. He's so funny. My parents were Taiwanese immigrants. He talks about how tough it was. They came over. They worked so hard. They wanted to make sure he could make a better life. And they put him through school, and he went through college, and they could never have known that he would have gotten here, had the best opportunity to start a new life, would have chosen to struggle as a stand-up comedian. And it's like this whole same framework. He uses it in a way of humor, but it feels like this funny thing that you can't set something on this. You can't set something on a trajectory, no matter if you're a parent or if you're a teacher, or if you're an ancestor. It doesn't work.
Michelle?
So I've been struggling with myself over this very nudge-nicky little piece that keeps shouting in my head about about the proper parallel here of the unanticipated consequences. Because one of the things that you noted was, who would know if they would go down to Egypt that they would go into slavery? Answer: we did. The Torah tells us that God said that this would happen, right? So I'm sorry. I just had to say that because I think sometimes there is a way in which we sometimes don't accept the things that we might have a sign of what could happen or what might happen if we do X, Y, or Z. And your point about the story, I think, is about Exodus from Egypt is a much better example of when there are times for big moves. There are times where you can't be the conservative with the small c. There are times for big moves because something is really broken. But I think another story which is told in our Talmud tells us, but even small actions, even the unanticipated consequences of small actions can have major effects. And so it's not just about the big things that you have to be cautious and careful. You have to be cautious and careful about everything. Which story am I talking about? You teach it to your 7th graders. You teach it to your 5th graders. I teach it to our 6th graders. It's the Kamsa Bar Kamsa story. There's this great story in the Talmud about somebody who invites somebody else to a party, and the invitation goes astray, and it goes to the wrong guy. The wrong guy shows up, and he won't let him in. And when he won't let him in, the rabbis just sit there quietly. And because the rabbis sit there quietly and they don't say anything to this incredible affront to a human person who wanted to engage, therefore, right, the guy who wasn't let into the party goes and sets up the Jewish people. He sets up the rabbis basically to not, it's a complicated story, but to not accept a sacrifice, which then causes the rulers to destroy the synagogue, the ancient synagogue, right? And so I think unintended consequences is such a critical concept in Jewish understanding, but is not just an understanding about big things. It's also about little things. And one of the things that I learned from the Kamsa Bar Kamsa story, and I think from Micha, is you got to lead with kindness. You got to lead with love. You got to lead with the intention for good for others, and not, I want to stop you in doing something, or I want the control of this particular thing, whether it's big or small. You got to lead with the kindness.
I wanted to thank you, Michelle. I want to talk about the decisions, quote unquote, smaller decisions that we make, and how that intersects with with unanticipated consequences. I want to talk about the subject of mental illness, which is very ubiquitous today. And I was just reading an article about the phenomenon of people who during COVID resigned. They quit their jobs. And their thinking was, I have job burnout, and therefore I'm going to quit my job, and therefore I'm going to leave job burnout, and therefore I'm going to be happier, and I'll start again. And the article was about, it's actually in the paper today, the Times today, is about I didn't realize that the issue was not my job, the issue was me. And that what was burned out was not the job, what was burned out was me and the job. And so I quit my job, little decision. I mean, that's right. It's not the exodus from Egypt. It's a little personal decision. But it turned out to have an unanticipated consequence that I'm worse off now, because now I don't have any structure, and now I'm not quite sure what to do. And now that I have no structure and don't know what to do, I'm even more depressed than I was. And I'm wondering how this law of unanticipated consequences, and all the people interviewed in this piece were quite miserable during their job, and they were quite convinced that when I leave my job, I'll be in a better place. And they were all shocked to a person, it's in today's paper, that actually now they're all worse off without the job. So it's not just that human beings get it wrong, we get it wrong. And I'm wondering how you see this principle of the law of unanticipated consequences play out, in our own lives and in our own community.
Well, I think it's part of everyday life that we have human beings, that is part of the decision making. How many times you hear about couples that they split because one of the members of the couple feels that he will be happier without that person, and then they regret that, And I have a close friend that when his parents, when he was a kid, his parents got divorced, all right? And then he went to therapy for so many years, so many decades, now the parents are back together. And he says, you could have saved me years of therapy, years of, paying a shrink, and now you're back together. So, but I believe, but I believe that it's part of everyday decisions that we make. Right. That I mean, there is in Spanish. I don't know if there is something here in English similar. It's like if you don't take a risk, you don't know if you are going to win or not. Something like that, translated. And that's the only way of knowing. That right. People who quit their jobs, they thought they were going to be in a better position. Then they have to deal with their spouses during COVID. So, good luck with that. Anyways, I had a wonderful time with my wife. Just clarifying.
Right.
But there's
but by the way, just in terms of, it feels like some of the center of gravity of this conversation is around my reality is imperfect, but should I leave my imperfect reality for who knows what will be worse on the other side of the change? And there's a powerful midrash that in next week's reading, B'Shalach, the Torah says that the Israelites went out chamushim alu, that they went out, and chamushim in the context means armed, that they went out with arms. But there's the famous midrash that connects chamushim to chamesh, fifth. And it says that basically that 1/5 of the Israelites went out. That is to say, according to this midrash, 80% of the Israelites would prefer the devil they know, slavery, to the devil they don't know, which is getting out of slavery. And only 1 out of 5 Israelites said, okay, we'll chuck slavery for the road ahead. And that is a further statement just about a human inertia.
That I was thinking about, and this is something that Mike can relate to probably, chaos theory, which is basically that that the world is really random, so that really every single action that we do will have a consequence, and some of them, the results of those consequences are maybe 100 years from now, and it's just like atoms bumping into each other and being pushed off in a different direction, and maybe that's the way, really, literally the way of the world, from a physics standpoint, a mathematical standpoint, but really what controls the whole world, in the sense that one of the things that we, I guess, as human beings try to do is try to put some order on the world, and every time we do that, it doesn't really matter.
How do you see all this complex of issues play out, a lot of unanticipated consequences, in terms of our synagogue as the 3-year anniversary of the pandemic comes up? Elias, I know when we were talking about this over the week, you're reflecting on Livestream. And how do you see how the whole phenomenon of Livestream before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and now post-pandemic evokes some of the uncertainties of the law of unanticipated consequences?
Yes, so, be careful what you wish at times. That's my statement. I remember, I think it was 2018, 2019, that I talked to all of you and said, guys, we need to do a better job. Many synagogues do live stream. We need to do that. We need to be up there. And we remember all how opposed Michelle was to that. and then we did a presentation to the board. And I remember doing some research about that. And then COVID hit. We didn't have a decision made already, right? We didn't have a decision before COVID about live stream. Then COVID hit, and then, we all know what happened. So it was interesting. The other day, there was, I don't know if some of you were part of the Jewish popular singers and composers like Paul Simon and Bob Dylan. And so there is a gentleman giving a class, which is fantastic. The first week we did it online. There were about 60 people online. And he, the one who was running the class, preferred to do it in person. So he said, okay, next Wednesday when we meet, I would love to be in person. So at that meeting in person was Yael, myself, and somebody else. And everybody else was online. And I said, why did I suggest the live stream? Anyways, so yeah, an anticipated thing. I prefer very much for us to be in person. All of us. Community is about being in person, but I also recognize the benefits of live stream for many people.
Right, and then you have the opposite of having 125 people coming to Shabbat dinner last night, which is an unintended consequence of COVID is that people now want to get out and actually be with each other more.
That's the other flip of the side.
It's two sides of a coin always.
So what does if you were to try to live intentionally with an awareness of the law of unanticipated consequences, what would it suggest for how we run the synagogue now as we're trying to emerge from the pandemic?
I'm not kidding.
Yeah.
I'm so grateful I'm not senior rabbis.
Yeah. Yeah. So. Yeah.
Anybody here?
Look, I'm just gonna. I don't think we're gonna solve how we run live stream here.
Yeah, nor am I talking specifically about live stream, but I'm just saying that the general issue about. So on the one hand, let me just zoom out for a second. The law of unanticipated consequences suggests humility and restraint because you don't know, right? But the counter tradition is lech lecha, that there's something about the current mode that's not okay, and it's going to take a dramatic gesture to change it, right? And I think that those two modes of humility and restraint in the face of what we don't know always bumps up against lech lecha. Right now, you're in idolatry land and you want a different land, a different move. You gotta make a dramatic change. I mean, just last Friday we did the funeral service for Margot Kahn, and she left Germany when she was 12 years old, and she left Germany when the Torah reading was lech lecha. Right, and so that was not a time for incremental, modest, humble restraint. That was a time for getting on the boat and coming to the new world. And thank God she did. So I guess what I'm asking you to think about, just as we close out this session, which is how do you think about balancing humility and restraint that goes with our not knowing, with the need to act boldly now because something is really broken, and you just bump up against that issue in your personal life. Should I stay at my job or leave my job? The Supreme Court in Obergefell bumped up against this. Should we allow gay people to get married or not? And there's just constantly, and we have that issue in any number of iterations. Any synagogue does, any business does. Now, how do you think about how to balance fiery urgency of now, which seems compelling, with humility and restraint, because we don't want to break stuff, which also seems compelling. Just close with that question.
That story that I told earlier about the entire temple falls because of this witnessing something that is completely unkind and not saying anything. And so to me, I think you can't ever know. You don't know for the little things, you don't know for the big things. Unintended consequences are a factor in everybody's life and at all levels, as you point out. So the only thing that you can do, I think the only thing we can do as a synagogue is lead with kindness and with faith, right? We say we have to believe. So for me, right, I have never been a big fan of Livestream because shul is not a spectator sport, and I think it's important to be here to see each other's faces, to talk to each other. But when the pandemic hit, it was the lifeline, and it has incredible, amazing good. And to this day, I teach a class every Thursday that's entirely online. It's on Zoom for the second year. Why? Because members in New York and in Florida and in California and in Denver can come and join the class and continue to be part of the connection. So I think that if we put our lens in terms of our faith, that we're doing something that is inclusive, that is kind, that is connective, we can do that at all levels. And we may need to make choices at some point, like you can't come to your concert during the concert online. You have to come in person, but you'll come back. You can get a recording of it later. But there's something that we have to do to build back our community, and that's true on every level. I think it's true for every issue you've raised here this morning, and there are so many of those issues you've raised this morning. It's true not just for something like Livestream, which is so simple and yet so complex. It's also true for Israel. It's also true, in this horrible tragedy, which I'm not ready to talk about yet this morning because it still feels so raw. But I think, what would it look like to look at our communities and ask the question, how do we police with kindness and with faith?
What I mean, the whole thing about, just to sum it up, a couple of little things about COVID and live stream. To me, being humble doesn't mean that I'm not going to take the risk of breaking things. Is that I'm going to continue doing that, knowing that I could fail. That for me is more the humbleness part.
So here's what I would leave us with, what I'm taking away from Danny and Micha's talk, is that there is a dance between two lenses, each of which is absolutely true. One is that there is a time for humility and restraint, because Lord knows what hurricane will follow from our action. I was in Israel visiting our father when Itamar Ben-Gvir went to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and oh my God, why did he do that? Humility and restraint. I mean, there are 8 dead Israelis because he did that. There are 8 dead Israelis because he did that. Humility and restraint, just predictable. Humility and restraint on the one hand, and on the other hand, Lech Lecha. There is a time for bold and dramatic action, and I think a lot of life is the dance between these two lenses, a time for humility and a time for the fiery urgency of now. And there's not one answer, but there's a perpetual dance. Elias, you got a song for us?
Yeah, let's sing together Imesh Kachek Yerushalayim because of the terror attack of Jerusalem. Imesh Kachek Yerushalayim Tishkach, Tishkach, Tishkach Yemini Imesh Kachek Yerushalayim Tishkach, Tishkach, Tishkach Yemini Im lo hale Yerushalayim al rosh simchati Im lo Yerushalayim al rosh simchati.
Thank you. Shabbat Shalom. And so our live stream will close now, and I would love to invite your thoughts and comments on all the complexities of this moment. Judy.